The wind screams across the North Atlantic like a living creature, tearing at the cliffs, hurling cold spray against stone older than memory. Down on the shoreline, where darkness meets the roar of the tide, a lone Viking forager wades waist-deep into churning water. His hands disappear beneath the foam, searching not for fish, not for shellfish, but for something stranger, long ribbons of bronze and emerald rising from the seabed like the hair of drowned spirits. As he pulls the seaweed free, it glistens in the pale winter sun, heavy with salt and promise. For most of the world, this is nothing more than ocean debris. But for him, and for his entire village waiting inland among the frost-bitten pines, it is the difference between hunger and endurance. In the Vikings' world, winter is not a season, it is a siege. Livestock grow thin, fjords freeze solid, and the sun often forgets to rise. Protein becomes rare, harder to find than iron in a battlefield. Yet somehow, these northern warriors, famed for their strength, their muscle, their unshakable stamina, survived climates that could kill an unprepared traveler within hours. The secret wasn't only in their weapons or willpower, but in a quiet adaptation shaped by the sea itself. While other civilizations looked to fields and herds, the Vikings learned to harvest the ocean in ways far more sophisticated than legend suggests. And at the heart of that survival was an ingredient so humble, so overlooked, that its story nearly vanished beneath centuries of salt and myth. Today, we can trace its presence in archaeological middens, in oral histories, in the soil of ancient Norse settlements, evidence of a food source that carried entire families through the coldest months. This is the untold story of how Vikings forged protein, not from the hunt, but from the waves. A story of resilience, ingenuity, and a coastline that fed a people when nothing else could. Winter in Scandinavia was not merely cold, it was catastrophic. The kind of cold that seeped into timber beams, splintered longship hulls, and turned breath to drifting crystals the moment it left your lungs. In these northern latitudes, the sun often rose reluctantly and disappeared far too quickly, leaving villages in near-permanent twilight. Fields lay smothered under blankets of snow so deep they swallowed fence posts whole. Streams froze into silence. Even the most seasoned hunters returned empty-handed as animals migrated, burrowed, or simply disappeared into the endless light. Protein essential for strength, muscle repair, and survival became almost impossible to obtain. Livestock struggled to survive on dwindling fodder, their ribs showing through winter coats. Fishing lines snapped in ice-laden waters, and nets froze stiff overnight. When the last of the salted meat barrels ran low, families faced a grim reality. Without a consistent source of nutrition, the human body begins to break down long before the thaw returns. It was during these dire months that the Vikings were forced to confront a brutal truth. Bravery alone could not outmatch starvation. Their legendary strength, the very engine behind raids, explorations, and long voyages, demanded constant fuel. But nature offered them no mercy, no fertile soil, no gentle pastures. Instead, it presented a wild, unpredictable coastline battered by storms. And it was in that unforgiving chaos that Viking ingenuity awakened. They began to seek sustenance not where it was obvious, but where it was abundant, hidden in plain sight, clinging to rocks, swaying beneath icy waves, thriving where nothing else dared to grow. Seaweed, misunderstood and ignored by many cultures, became their silent salvation. Faced with a landscape that took far more than it gave, the Vikings learned to harvest the ocean itself, discovering that the key to surviving the impossible winter lay not in the hunt, but in the shoreline. To most modern eyes, seaweed is little more than slippery refuse washed ashore after a storm, a nuisance underfoot, a tangle of odd shapes and grime. But to the Vikings, standing at the crossroads of survival and salvation, it became something far greater. An overlooked lifeline hiding in the churn of the North Atlantic. Along the Scandinavian coastline grew an astonishing variety of marine plants, kelp stretching meters long, frilled dulse glowing deep red, bladderwrack shimmering like polished bronze. These species didn't merely survive the cold, they thrived in it, drawing minerals from seawater and storing sunlight in dense, nutrient-rich fronds. The Vikings might not have known the modern words iodine, polysaccharides, amino acids, but they understood results. They noticed how certain seaweeds restored strength after hard labor, soothed throats irritated by smoke, or revived a weary traveler faster than stale bread ever could. They learned that dried kelp provided not just roughage but valuable protein, modest in percentage yet vital when multiplied across days and weeks. Children gnawed on dried dulse as a chewy snack. Warriors sailing out through icy fog carried bundles of preserved seaweed alongside their hardtack, knowing it kept their bodies steady when storms stole their appetite. Even the livestock benefited. Cows and fed bits of seaweed produced richer milk and endured the cold more easily. Slowly, what began as desperation transformed into knowledge, and then into practice. Seaweed became woven into Norse survival not as a luxury, but as a quiet source of strength. Archaeologists today find traces of these marine plants preserved in ancient hearths and midden piles, confirming what the sagas only hint at. The ocean fed them in ways far more profound than fish alone. In a world where every calorie mattered, where every winter tested the limits of human endurance, the Vikings learned to see nourishment where others saw nothing. And in doing so, they uncovered one of the most resilient food sources nature had to offer. Long before modern nutritionists praised seaweed as a superfood, the Vikings had already discovered a way to transform it into something powerful, portable, and astonishingly durable. They called it tangyol, literally seaweed meal, a fine, dark powder created through a process as practical as it was ingenious. The idea was simple. Take a resource the ocean offered freely, strip it of its water, and concentrate everything left behind. But in execution, it was a small miracle of observation, fire, and patience. First came the gathering of thick bands of kelp, fronds of dulse, knots of bladder, but raw seaweed, heavy with brine, spoiled quickly. The Vikings needed a way to turn it into something that could endure weeks of cold storage or long voyages across the North Atlantic. So they dried it, sometimes on wooden racks set high enough to catch the sun, sometimes near fire pits, where smoke curled around the fronds, driving off moisture while infusing them with a faint, earthy flavor. Fire accelerated the process. Heat broke down cell walls, making the seaweed easier to grind and intensifying its natural umami. On some archaeological sites in Norway and Iceland, layers of ash and dried kelp residue still cling to stones, silent witnesses to these ancient preparations. Once brittle enough to crumble between fingers, the seaweed was crushed, worked between hand stones, or pounded in wooden bowls until it became a rough, almost flour-like meal. And in this humble powder, nutrients were trapped and preserved. Essential minerals, trace proteins, natural salts, even antioxidants. A handful of tangyol stirred into porridge or mixed with grains could transform a weak winter ration into something strengthening. For sailors facing endless gray seas or farmers bracing for weeks of dwindling supplies, this powder became a quiet form of insurance. It was edible even when everything else froze, a compact reserve of the ocean's energy. Tangyol wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't spoken of in sagas, but in the long shadows of winter, it may have been as vital as iron, wool, or fire. Harvesting seaweed was never a gentle stroll along the shoreline. It was a calculated dance with the ocean, a ritual shaped by timing, tide, and the raw temperament of nature. The Vikings knew the sea well enough to respect its moods, and gathering its hidden bounty demanded precision. They waited for extreme low tides, the rare hours when the ocean briefly pulled back its curtain to reveal the forests below vast, slippery gardens of kelp swaying like creatures dreaming beneath the waves. Men and women moved quickly across the exposed rocks, boots gripping wet stone, woven baskets slung over their shoulders. The air smelled of salt and iron. Each step carried risk. One misstep meant tumbling into a crevice or being caught by a sudden surge of returning water. But they were practiced. They used hooked sticks to pull in long ribbons of kelp, knives chipped from iron or bone to cut fronds cleanly, leaving the base intact so the plant could regrow. Children helped too, hauling lighter bundles, their laughter swallowed by the wind. It wasn't just labor, it was community. The horizon burned with sunrise or dimmed toward dusk as families worked side by side, aware that every handful they collected meant another day of security when winter tightened its grip. Their baskets filled with green and red fronds, each species chosen for a purpose. Dulse for eating fresh or drying quickly, kelp for grinding into protein-rich tangyol, bladder wrack for medicinal uses. Waves crashed and receded, time marked by the rhythm of the sea itself. When the tide shifted, the Vikings retreated with their loads, scrambling up slick paths carved by generations of feet. Behind them, the ocean reclaimed the garden, swallowing the last glimmers of sunlight off the wet rocks. What they carried home wasn't just food, it was the memory of the coastline, the pulse of the sea, the promise that even in the harshest months, survival was still within reach for those willing to gather it. Back in the Viking settlements, clusters of long houses huddled against the wind, the seaweed harvest began its transformation through fire. Drying wasn't just a chore. It was a careful sensory craft shaped by heat, smoke, and instinct. Raw seaweed was heavy, slick, and vulnerable to rot. So the first step was to lay it out across wooden racks positioned near the hearths. Flames flickered low, never too close, their warmth rising in gentle waves. Children fed the fire with driftwood, while elders judged the temperature by the scent in the air. Too hot and the fronds would char, too cool and they would mold. Smoke curled around the leaves, weaving into them a deep, earthy aroma that Viking sailors later recognized instantly, like the smell of home carried halfway across the world. On stormy days, when sunlight vanished behind gray skies, the drying racks were moved indoors, close enough to smoky stone hearths that the seaweed crisped slowly over hours. Heat pushed out the brine, causing fronds to stiffen and darken. Modern chemistry explains this change. As water evaporates, cell walls collapse, concentrating the natural glutamates that create the savory umami flavor. To the Vikings, it simply tasted strong, a flavor that meant energy, warmth, and endurance. Some fronds were lightly roasted on flat stones placed at the edge of the fire pit, crackling as they crisped. Others were left to dry for days until they snapped cleanly in hand. Archaeologists have found charred kelp remnants in ancient hearths across Norway and Iceland, suggesting these methods were common, even habitual. By the end of the process, the seaweed was no longer a slippery mass, but a resilient, flavorful ingredient. It weighed a fraction of its original mass, preserved by fire, ready to be ground, stored, or eaten outright. In a world where food spoiled quickly and winters were merciless, this transformation through heat was nothing short of alchemy. The Vikings, using intuition and necessity, had unlocked a method of turning ocean plants into a long-lasting, protein-rich resource, achieved not through complex tools, but through the primal force of fire. Once the seaweed had dried to a crisp, its transformation was only halfway complete. The Vikings still needed to turn these brittle fronds into something versatile, something they could pack into voyages, mix into gruels, or store for months without fear of spoilage. And so began the grinding, a rhythmic, physical ritual that echoed across longhouse courtyards like the steady heartbeat of survival. Women knelt beside flat grinding stones, the same tools used for grains, and pressed the roasted seaweed between them. With each sweep of the upper stone smooth, rounded, darkened by generations of use, the fronds splintered apart, cracking and crumbling into finer and finer pieces. Children helped, fascinated by the color. Deep green, nearly black, shimmering with salt crystals that caught the light like crushed obsidian. The smell was unmistakable, smoky, oceanic, almost meaty in its intensity. Every breath carried hints of iodine and brine. Slowly, under hands hardened by cold and labor, the seaweed turned into coarse flakes, then gravel-like grains, and finally into the coveted powder called tangmjöl seaweed meal. At this stage, it was astonishingly light, a concentrated essence of the ocean reduced to something as soft as ash, yet packed with nutrients. Modern analysis reveals that dried seaweed contains small but significant amounts of protein, along with essential minerals like iron, magnesium, and iodine nutrients. Vikings rarely found in winter, but to them, this powder meant something far simpler: strength. They stored it in leather pouches, clay jars sealed with wax or fat, even sewn pockets inside traveling cloaks. Sailors sprinkled it into hot water for an instant broth. Farmers stirred it into porridge. Warriors chewed it dry during long training marches when time was short and endurance mattered more than taste. Tangmjöl was not glamorous. It didn't appear in sagas or feast descriptions, yet it was immortal in its own way, quiet, dependable, and forged through skill rather than chance. In the grinding of seaweed into meal, the Vikings had effectively bottled the energy of the ocean itself, creating a protein source that followed them wherever their journeys led. Across farm fields, across kingdoms, even across entire seas. Tongmjöl rarely stayed a powder for long. In Viking kitchens, warm pockets of life inside longhouses battered by wind, this ocean-born meal found new form when mixed with grains. Barley, rye, and oats were the backbone of Norse nutrition, dependable crops that clung to survival in the thin northern soil. But in the dead of winter, even these grains could feel monotonous, their porridge bland, their bread dense and heavy. Seaweed changed that. Women stirred the dark green powder into steaming pots, watching it dissolve into the bubbling mix like ink spreading on parchment. The aroma that rose from the cauldron was unmistakable, smoky, salty, energizing. The Vikings didn't have a word for umami, but they understood its power. Food that tasted full, food that revived the body after a day in the cold, food that lingered on the tongue like a promise. Sometimes the mixture became a thick gruel, the kind eaten at dawn before long hours of fishing or chopping wood. Other times it formed dough, barley loaves flecked with seaweed, baked on hot stones or inside clay ovens warmed by peat fires. These loaves traveled well. Wrapped in cloth or tucked into leather bags, they became rations for hunters, shepherds, and seafarers. Their color was unusual, darker than typical bread, but their effect was undeniable. They kept the Vikings moving when meat was scarce and daylight shorter than a whispered prayer. Tongmjöl also found its way into journey cakes. Dense, compact discs made for expeditions. Warriors carried them aboard longships, where time blurred and meals needed to be fast, filling, and immune to the damp air of the open sea. Modern nutritional science affirms what Vikings discovered by instinct: combining seaweed with grains creates a more complete protein profile, balancing amino acids in ways nature alone seldom provides. But for the Norse people, this wasn't chemistry, it was survival. A merging of land and sea, field and shoreline, woven together in everybody. Through these simple mixtures, they stretched their harvests further, strengthened their bodies, and created meals that could outlast winter itself. Long before microbiology had known, the Vikings understood something profound. Food left to rest could change, deepen, and even grow more nourishing. Fermentation was woven into their culture, from mead bubbling in wooden vats to fish buried beneath stones, so it was only natural that some forms of seaweed found their place in this quiet alchemy. After drying and grinding, certain batches of seaweed meal were mixed with grains and left covered near warm hearths. Over hours or days, the mixture developed a tangier aroma, a subtle shift the Vikings recognized instinctively as a sign of transformation. They didn't know it, but beneficial microbes were breaking down tough plant fibers, unlocking vitamins, and making minerals more bioavailable. The result was a food that hit the body differently, easier to digest, longer lasting in energy, and richer in nutrients during the harshest parts of winter. In coastal communities of the North Atlantic today, from the Faroe Islands to parts of Iceland, similar traditions survive, echoing the methods the Vikings likely practiced. Mild fermentation allowed seaweed to soften, its umami deepening as natural sugars broke down. To Norse families, the taste was bold but comforting, a flavor tied to hearth smoke, damp wool, and the soft roar of wind against the walls. Some fermented seaweed pastes were shaped into small cakes, stored in cool corners of longhouses, and eaten sparingly, almost medicinally. Warriors believed such food steadied the stomach before voyages. Mothers fed them to children to strengthen them during deep winter. The process required patience and trust that nature, given time, would make the food not only safe but powerful. Archaeological layers hint at these practices: unusual concentrations of marine bacteria, softened kelp remnants, even storage pits with traces of fermented plant matter. Modern science confirms what Viking instinct had long ago observed. Fermentation increases nutrient absorption and can boost the protein availability of seaweeds. But for the Vikings, this wasn't science. It was wisdom whispered through generations. A quiet partnership between humans, the sea, and the unseen world of living cultures. Through fermentation, they found yet another way to stretch the gifts of the ocean, transforming simple seaweed into a superfood that fortified mind, muscle, and spirit. To the Vikings, food was never just fuel, it was medicine, strength, and resilience woven into daily life. And seaweed, humble as it seemed, carried properties that made it far more valuable than a simple supplement. Long before modern science identified iodine as essential for thyroid function, the Norse recognized that those who regularly ate certain seaweeds remained sharper, warmer, and more energetic through brutal winters. In a world where goiter and fatigue plagued inland communities across medieval Europe, coastal Vikings unknowingly protected themselves through the mineral-rich plants gathered from their shores. Bladderwrack and kelp, in particular, were prized not only for their modest protein, but for their impact on overall vitality. Women mixed dried fragments into broths given to the sick or exhausted, believing the ocean's essence could restore balance to the body. Warriors consumed it before voyages, claiming it steadied their breath and strengthened their limbs when cold winds cut through layers of wool and leather. The natural vitamin C in certain seaweeds even protected them from scurvy, a disease that ravaged sailors centuries later with terrifying efficiency. Vikings rarely wrote about such illnesses, not because they were immune, but because their proximity to the ocean gave them natural defenses others lacked. Healers, often women with knowledge passed through generations, used seaweed poultices on wounds, burns, and inflamed joints. The alginates within kelp helped retain moisture and soothe damaged skin, while the iodine acted as a primitive antiseptic, long before the word existed. Deep within sagas and folklore are hints of these practices, mentions of sea herbs, shore plants, and substances gathered under the gaze of sea spirits. Modern archaeology adds its voice, uncovering traces of medicinal seaweed in burial sites and domestic hearths from Norway to Orkney. What the Vikings understood instinctively, we can now measure. Seaweed is one of the most nutrient-dense plants on Earth, carrying iron, magnesium, zinc, antioxidants, and minerals essential for survival in cold climates. To them, it wasn't chemistry, it was life. A guardian from the sea. A healer wrapped in green fronds. A quiet, reliable force that helped their bodies endure hardships that modern people can barely imagine. On the open sea, where horizons blurred and time dissolved into the rhythmic waves, survival depended on what you could carry and what you could endure. Viking voyages were not measured in hours or even days, but in weeks, spent navigating unpredictable weather, icy spray, and winds that could turn a calm journey into a struggle for life within moments. Food had to withstand damp air, sudden storms, and constant motion. Anything prone to rotting or molding was a liability. That is why seaweed protein, transformed into dried tangyo and journey cakes, became an unsung champion of the Viking diet afloat. Packed tightly in wax-coated leather pouches or tucked inside wooden boxes sealed with tar, these lightweight stores outlasted salted meat, cheese, and fish. Even when the air was thick with moisture, the concentrated seaweed remained edible, its low water content acting as a natural preservative. Sailors needed only a cup of hot water to make a quick broth, a smoky, mineral-rich drink that warmed the chest and sharpened the senses during night watches. Mixed with crushed barley, it formed a dense paste that could be eaten with one hand while the other held the oar in a storm. Seaweed rations didn't spoil, didn't freeze, and didn't require fire-crucial advantages when rain soaked every log on board or winds made cooking impossible. More importantly, these ocean-forged foods kept muscles from failing. Protein deficiencies could sap strength dangerously fast when rowing 12 hours a day. Iodine and iron kept minds clear and energy steady, preventing the lethargy and confusion that could cost a crew their bearings. During long crossings to Iceland, Greenland, or beyond, these rations became silent guardians, sustaining warriors and farmers alike as they pushed deeper into unknown waters. The sagas celebrate bravery, storms, and victories, but they do not celebrate the small meals eaten under cracked shields to keep them alive between battles. Yet without those humble seaweed rations, many such journeys would have ended long before landfall. In the places where maps ended and uncertainty began, the Vikings carried the ocean's strength with them, not just beneath their ships, but within their food. Strength was not a luxury in the Viking world, it was a requirement. Every raid, every voyage, every farmstead defended against the biting cold demanded bodies capable of extraordinary endurance. When a shield wall formed, it wasn't simply a line of warriors. It was a human fortress, each fighter relying on the stamina, sharpness, and resilience of the one beside him. And while sagas glorify feasts of roasted meat and overflowing mead horns, the reality was far more elemental. Much of that famed Viking strength was built on unglamorous, quietly powerful foods like seaweed. In harsh winters or on long campaigns, meat was scarce. Even preserved foods dwindled. But seaweed dried, ground, mixed with grains remained constant. Its minerals kept thyroids functioning, preventing the sluggishness that could cripple a fighter in freezing weather. Its trace proteins helped maintain muscle during months when hunting was impossible. Its salts and natural electrolytes replaced what was lost through labor, rowing, and battle. Imagine a Viking shield wall in formation. Rows of men shoulder to shoulder, breath steaming in the air. Shields tilted forward like a single wooden beast. Spears bristle between the gaps. Boots rooted in frozen soil. Every heartbeat matters. Every breath must be steady. Every muscle must obey without hesitation. Their stamina did not come from rare feast days. It came from daily sustenance, designed to keep them alive through deprivation. Archaeological studies reveal that coastal Vikings had surprisingly balanced nutrient profiles, far healthier than many inland Europeans of the same era. Seaweed played a quiet role in this, fortifying the people who built longships, carved settlements out of unforgiving landscapes, and crossed oceans few dared to imagine. The sea armed them with more than ships and fish. It strengthened their bodies from the inside out. In every clash of metal, in every sprint across uneven ground, in every shield raised against an enemy's strike, traces of the ocean were present, woven into muscle and bone. Seaweed protein was never sung of in sagas, but without it, the shield wall itself might never have stood. To the Vikings, the sea was far more than a resource. It was a living presence, a world unto itself with moods, tempers, and deities who could bless or destroy without warning. Every wave carried a whisper of myth. Every tide felt like the breath of spirits unseen. And woven into that worldview was the belief that seaweed, those strange, slippery plants rising from the deep, was not merely food, but a gift from forces older than mankind. In Norse cosmology, the sea belonged to Aegir and Ran, a husband and wife pair of powerful Jotuns who ruled the waters with unpredictable grace. Ran, especially, was feared. She was said to drag sailors into her nets, keeping the drowned as treasures beneath the waves. Yet even she had benevolent moments, releasing bounty along the shoreline after storms. Seaweed washed ashore in tangled heaps was often seen as an offering, evidence that the sea had chosen, at least for a moment, to give instead of take. Children grew up hearing that the long ribbons of kelp were ram's hair, and disturbing too much of it without reason risked angering them. So when Vikings harvested seaweed during low tides, they did so with quiet respect, aware that they were entering the realm of ancient spirits. Some foragers left small tokens, shells, bits of bone, carved wood wedged between rocks as thanks. In certain coastal communities, the first seaweed of the season was burned in a small ceremonial fire. The smoke carried toward the ocean as a promise of gratitude and restraint. These beliefs didn't weaken their practicality, they strengthened it. By treating the coastline as sacred, the Vikings avoided overharvesting. They took only what they needed, allowing marine forests to flourish year after year. Myth became sustainability. Ritual became resource management. Even today, traces of these ideas linger along Nordic coasts, where seaweed is gathered with a blend of reverence and tradition. To the Vikings, every frond held a fragment of story, a connection to gods, ancestors, and the vast, unknowable world beneath the waves. The protein they extracted was not only nourishment, it was communion with the sea itself, a bond between mortals and the forces that shaped their world. For centuries, the story of Viking seaweed use lingered only in hints, whispers in sagas, fragments in folklore, and a curious absence of nutritional deficiencies in skeletons recovered from harsh northern settlements. But in recent decades, archaeology has begun to illuminate what history left in shadow. Along the coasts of Norway, Iceland, and the Northern Isles, researchers have uncovered middens, ancient refuse heaps, where layers of ash, bone, and shells mingle with unmistakable traces of kelp and bladderwrack. Some pieces are charred, others partially mineralized, their cellular structures still recognizable under microscopes. These remnants suggest not accidental burning but deliberate processing, consistent with drying or roasting practices that match the methods preserved in later Nordic traditions. At excavations in Orkney and the Faroes, hearthstones show faint residue patterns, thin carbon films with the unique chemical signature of brown algal cell walls, laid down centuries before written records began. In Iceland, isotopic analysis of human remains from the settlement era reveals elevated levels of iodine and marine-derived nutrients, markers of diets rich not only in fish but in sea vegetables. Meanwhile, Norse-era tools found near tidal zones, stone scrapers, hooked staffs, woven baskets with salt-resistant fibers match what would be expected of organized seaweed harvesting. Ethnographers studying later Scandinavian coastal communities have documented practices eerily aligned with what the archaeological record suggests. Drying kelp by hearth heat, grinding it with quernstones, mixing it into bread dough, even lightly fermenting it for winter medicines. It is a living echo of a forgotten system. Together, these clues form a mosaic more compelling than any single artifact. They show a people who understood their environment intimately, not simply raiders or warriors, but skilled coastal stewards who recognized the ocean as both battlefield and pantry. Archaeology reveals what the sagas omitted: that Viking strength was sustained not only by livestock and fish, but by the quiet, persistent harvests of the shoreline. Through every carbon trace, every mineral reading, every preserved prawn, science is now giving voice to a truth. The Vikings lived by a truth that modern eyes are only beginning to appreciate. In the end, the story of Viking seaweed protein is not one of desperation, it is one of ingenuity. A testament to a people who refused to let an unforgiving land dictate the limits of their survival. While the world remembers the Vikings for their longships, their raids, and their mythic sagas, the deeper truth lies in how they endured the silent wars. The hunger, the cold, the endless winters that swallowed weaker cultures whole. They survived not by brute force alone, but by listening to their environment, the crash of waves, the pull of tides, the seasonal rhythms that offered clues to endurance. Seaweed was never a headline in their history, yet it was woven into their strength. It hid in their porridge bowls, in the rations tucked beneath a warrior's cloak, in the powders ground by tired hands near flickering hearths. It traveled across oceans with them, seeped into their bones through minerals modern medicine now praises, and nourished them when the world turned white and silent. In every frond dried over a hearth, in every loaf darkened with kelp, in every bundle carried across frozen stones, there was a quiet message: survive by seeing what others overlook. Today, as scientists rediscover seaweed's value, its proteins, antioxidants, essential minerals, we are reminded that ancient wisdom often predates modern understanding. The Vikings didn't need laboratories to know the ocean could feed them. They lived the proof. Their story teaches us that resilience comes not from abundance, but from creativity. Not from conquest alone, but from cooperation with the forces that shape our world. Seaweed was their hidden ally, the silent ingredient in their strength, the unrecorded chapter in their endurance. And perhaps that is why their legacy remains so powerful. They endured because they adapted. They thrived because they noticed. And all along their storm-lashed shores, the ocean waited, offering them the quiet, steady nourishment that helped a civilization rise from frost and stone.